Hi friends, this is Josh from musiclikeyoumeanit.com. Thanks for joining me for this next installment in the From Start to Finish Metalcore series. Today I'm going to talk about ghost note snare samples and how I've placed them and processed them in this mix to sound as realistic as possible. Probably the best place to start is, what's a ghost note? If you're not a drummer or just not familiar with this concept, it's definitely worth taking a minute to listen to a drummer who plays with a lot of dynamics in these heavier genres. If you go check out drum videos for bands like Animals as Leaders, Periphery, or Tesseract, it may help you get a better idea of what I'm talking about here. Just generally speaking, on drums, a ghost note is played quieter and as a result has a much different timbre than a note played at a louder dynamic. That means that there's not just a volume difference here, but there's a very big overall tone difference. I want to stress this point because I've heard really good bands on major labels release albums where the ghost note samples were just normal high-velocity snare samples placed in at a lower volume. This is not only less enjoyable to listen to, but in the end, it just sounds unprofessional and unconvincing. I promise you won't regret putting in the time now to listen to some good drummers playing with dynamics so you know how it sounds. In this mix, there's one part of the song where the drum groove is really held down by some ghost notes. I wanted these to stick out because it's really a cool part of the song, but I still wanted them to sound natural. When you're trying to recreate a ghost note with samples, you have to both capture the more gentle snare top attack along with the accentuated rattle of the snare bottom. Let me show you the part of the song that has all these ghost notes so you can hear what it is I was going for. So we've got quite a range of snare dynamics here. Let me break down how I was able to get that sound using samples. As a reminder, this mix actually doesn't have any live snare performance in it, so I have a session sample that was recorded during the original recording session, and then a snare bottom sample, playing the role of what would normally be my live snare tracks in the mix. There is also a one-shot snare sample, which here is only playing on the accent notes. If you haven't yet, make sure to check out the other videos in this series where I cover how I processed those tracks. When it came time to work with the ghost note portion of this song, I had to dive back into my sample collection to select a snare top sample that would work for this sound. The snare bottom sample I was using already sounded great for these ghost notes, so that's making up a large portion of the sound. And then I used that snare top sample just to add a little bit more clarity and definition to the notes in the groove. To show you what I mean, I'll play that section again with just the snare soloed, and then I'll take out the snare top sample and the snare bottom sample so you can hear what each is contributing to the final sound. So you can hear I'm getting a lot of the sound from the session bottom sample, which is pretty realistic when ghost notes are played on the snare drum. That's because the snare wires are activated disproportionately on these quieter notes, making up a larger part of the overall sound. The snare top track, then, is just adding a little bit of extra definition. Let me show you that one by itself so you can hear more clearly what it's contributing. So you can hear how this sample is a very low velocity hit as well as being at a low volume in the mix. That's what I was talking about earlier when I said ghost notes are not just full velocity samples at a lower volume. You can hear clearly that this sample is a snare drum being played very gently. And that's what creates this realistic ghost note sound in the final snare tone. Once you've dialed in the ghost note sample tone you want, it's also important to get the balance right in the mix. Here, I've put these actually kind of loud in terms of balance between the ghost notes and the accent notes being played on the snare drum. But that'll be different from part to part in a song, and you want to just make sure that the ghost notes are sitting where you need them to in the groove. With sample ghost notes, it's actually easy to push them too loud in the mix. So you'll just want to make sure that you're listening in the context of the mix and that the level decisions you're making are serving the song as a whole. Now, I mentioned there aren't any live snare recordings in this song, but I want to take a brief moment to also address how I like to work with ghost notes on live snares as well. Depending on how the recording sounds on a live snare track, sometimes you can adjust a gate to open differently during quieter portions of the snare sound so that the ghost notes can get through on the live track. I have found, especially in these heavier genres though, that oftentimes there's just so much cymbal bleed in the snare tracks that it's mostly impractical to automate a gate that opens and closes on each ghost note. I definitely evaluate it on a song-by-song basis, but getting good at programming ghost note snare samples is also effective as a tool when you need to work with a song where ghost notes are played on a live snare track, but you just have too much bleed to include them in the mix. If you can program realistic sounding snare samples that match the tone of the live snare drum, you can use those to give more definition to these quieter, more nuanced snare parts without having to compromise your snare tone with the cymbal bleed. In terms of the processing I've applied to the ghost notes, I've kept the same processing on the snare bottom track that I have for the rest of the mix, and then for the snare top ghost note track, I've applied the same processing I have on the session sample, which is sort of serving as my main snare top sound. My goal was to get this tone as close as possible to that one, so that the dynamic changes would sound as realistic as possible. Check out my other snare processing video if you want to see more details about what I did there. And that's all I have for you today on processing ghost notes snare samples. If you've ever worked with snare ghost notes in a heavier mix before, and you've found a solution that worked well for you, leave me a comment below. I'd be interested to hear what you've done. Thanks again for hanging out with me today, everyone. Keep making great music, and I will look forward to seeing you next time.